It's 2023, and the world's population is about 8 billion. Two countries hold the bulk of this population, China and India. Both of these countries have about 1.4 billion each, although China is leading by 14 million. The United States comes in third at the world population ranking at just over 330 million. The fourth place ranking goes to Indonesia with 280 million, and last place in the top 5 countries with the most population in the world goes to Pakistan with 248 million. But the world wasn't always as populated in the past as it is today. Let's go ahead and take a look at the history of population. Society was primarily of the hunter-gatherer formation before becoming more agricultural. This transition occurred between 8,000 to 5,000 BC. The entire world population had been under 200 million for most of its existence, only reaching that 200 million level around 1 AD. 200 million, for comparison, is about the population of Nigeria in 2020. So think of all of Nigeria, but spread out over multiple continents. Birth rates were high, but so were death rates, and population was further reduced by famine, war, and epidemics. One classic example of population reduction comes from the mid-1300s, known as the Black Death or bubonic plague. And this epidemic is estimated to have reduced the populations of Europe and China by 1/3 to 1/2. That's a massive loss of population. Although war, famine, and disease, along with general high mortality rates, still kept the world's population at a relatively tame level, by 1600 the world population had grown to about 500 million people, which is about 1.5 times the population of the United States today. But the quality of life started to get gradually better in the mid-1600s. An increase in commerce and new developments in food production, food security, and nutrition helped decrease mortality. By 1800, the world population had finally reached 1 billion for the first time. But this was only the beginning. Just a reminder that the world's population had been less than 200 million for most of human existence. That's less than the 2020 population of Nigeria. It took 1,600 years for population to increase to 500 million people. But then, in the course of only 200 years, the world population had more than doubled. But things would only speed up from here. The 1800s brought the Industrial Revolution and an absolute surge in population. Europe was a huge driver in growth, both for themselves and for increasing the population of the US through immigration. Although developed countries had faster growing populations during this period, the less developed countries still experienced a population growth. But the thing to note is that the less developed countries together already made up the bulk of the world's population, this being mainly China and India respectively. China's population reached 400 million before 1830, up from 330 million in 1800, and India's was around 200 million. By 1900, India's population had reached 300 million. China's was still around 400 million in 1900 after dipping slightly between 1800 to 1900. In comparison, the US only had a population of 24 million in 1850. This is up from a population of only 6 million in 1800. So in just 50 years, the US added 18 million people. This was partially due to the influx of European immigrants mentioned earlier. The world first reached 1 billion in 1800. By 1900, the world population had grown to about 1.7 billion thanks to continued improvements in medicine and sanitation, which overall bolstered life expectancies and reduced mortality rates. The world population reached 2 billion by 1930. Then, by 1960, which was only 30 years later, the world population had grown by another billion. 14 years later, in 1974, the world had another billion people. 12 years after that, in 1986, there was another billion, adding up to 5 billion total. 6 billion was reached 13 years later in 1999, and 7 billion another 12 years later in 2011. World population in 2022 allegedly reached the 8 billion mark, 11 years after the last billion was added. I say allegedly because some sources will say we are still at 7.9565 million. It can truly be difficult to get an accurate number for population, so we don't really know for sure if we passed 8 billion yet or not. But for convenience, I am just going to say that we have. 1 million people is so much less than a billion, but we now have so many more people that can contribute to population growth. So we end up with an exponential growth in population. Remember that we went from less than 200 million for most of human existence, from like 8,000 years ago, to 8 billion people over the course of 2,000 years. And if you look from 1600, where the population was only 500 million, then it only took 400 years for the entire world population to grow from 500 million to 8 billion people. It really is an unprecedented and massive explosion of population compared to all of human history.